In this video, I'm going to show you how to take an existing part and make a carbon fiber replica of that part. I'm going to show you the whole process from beginning to end, including making the mold and then making the carbon fiber part from that mold. Let's go ahead and get started. First things first, before you get started, take a look at your part. Make sure that you have the surface finish that you want on that part, because if you've got scratches and things inside there that are visible, they're going to show up in the mold, and then they're going to show up in the carbon fiber part once you're finished. So make sure you've got the surface finish you want before you start. This one had a few scratches in it, so I went ahead and took some 1000 grit sandpaper and wet sanded those out to get it nice, smooth, shiny the way I wanted it before we started. And before you can make the mold, we want to build up a flange around the part. This has a couple of purposes. One is it gives you, on the mold, it gives you a flange, something you can hold on to while you're working, so you don't have to stick your thumb inside the part, inside the resin while you're working on brushing the epoxy in. But the other reason, and this is perhaps more important, is that you don't want to have resin get around the back side of the part while you're trying to lay up the mold. Because what that'll do is all the little fingers of resin coming around the back side, they're going to actually lock it in place, and you're going to have to crack the edges of your mold and actually break it in order to get the part out when you're done. What I like to use for that is, this is just foam board, dollar store foam board, and I put a strip of packing tape on one side. That's just going to act as a release so the epoxy doesn't stick to it. And I cut it into a 2-inch wide strip with the packing tape on there, and we're going to hot glue it to the back side. I'll show you how to do that. And just work your way around the edges, gradually putting piece by piece in place. All right, so I've got this all the way around with the flange. It's not perfect. Now, I think this is key. The flange doesn't have to be perfect, because this is not the surface of your actual mold. It's just to provide some area around the mold for you to work around, to hold the mold while you're working in it, whatever. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's going to have some wrinkles and whatnot. If you look closely, I had to put several seams all the way around here because I couldn't get the foam board to wrap around real nicely. Anywhere I've got a seam, I went ahead and just put a piece of tape over it, just to provide a complete surface all the way across, and to reinforce it so it doesn't pop off later. Our next step, we need to go ahead and wax this mold. And for that, I like to use Partol number 2. There are lots of different mold release waxes you can use. This is what I've been using for years. I like the stuff, it works well. Just take a clean cloth, swipe some, and just rub it all over the mold. Just get the whole, not the mold, the whole part. Get the whole part covered, including the edges. Make sure you get all the way around the edges, and make sure you get everywhere you've got this packing tape on the flange. The whole flange needs to be covered with some paste. All right, once you've got it completely coated, we're going to buff it off, but we're only going to buff it off, I think, of just the mold surface itself. I'm not too worried about the flanges where you've got the packing tape, because again, it doesn't need to be super pretty. But I'm going to buff it off. Just take a clean paper towel and just go in smooth circles, buffing it off. How do you know when it's done, when it's fully buffed? Well, as you're dragging it along, you can feel it kind of dragging on the surface a little bit. The paper towel drags a little bit on the surface as it sticks to the wax. Eventually, it's going to stop sticking, and it's just going to feel smooth and slippery. That's when you know you're done. If you look at it in the light, it should look nice and shiny. It's going to give it a little bit of a shine. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and give it one more coat. All right, we've got the surface all waxed and ready to go. But if you look carefully, you notice there are some gaps right on the seam where our foam board is connected to the edge of the part. And we don't want those gaps there, because if the resin seeps underneath, then it's going to create a mechanical lock. We're going to go ahead and use the same wax that we used before to fill in that gap. We're just going to make a fillet all along there, all the way around the part. Now there's one other thing I forgot to mention. I'll go ahead and take care of that now. This hole right here, we don't want to make sure that this hole doesn't get filled with epoxy. So all I'm going to do is just take a plain old piece of cellophane tape and just put it over the top of that hole. Wipe just a little wax on it so it doesn't stick, and then we're good to go. All right, we've got our part all waxed and ready to go. The last thing we need to do before we're ready to do our layup of our mold is go ahead and put on the PVA. PVA stands for polyvinyl acrylate, I think. Doesn't really matter what the acronym actually means, but this is a water-based, water-soluble substance that really what this is doing is providing a chemical barrier on the mold surface. So the wax makes it slippery so the part can slip right off and pop right off real easily. This is a chemical barrier so that the epoxy can't make a chemical bond to whatever your surface is. You really need both parts for this system to work. I like to use a foam brush. I found the best luck with a foam brush for applying this to a mold surface. Just dip it in and it's super simple, just brush it on. Some people would tell you that you've got to spray on the PVA to get a good finish. I've always had good luck with just brushing it on with a foam brush, especially for smaller parts. All right, we're good to go. I'm going to let this dry for probably half an hour at least. Make sure it's completely dry before you start doing your first layup. All right, so our PVA is dry. We're ready to go ahead and start with the first part of making our mold. We're going to start with a tooling coat. Now, some places actually make special tooling coats specifically for the surface of a mold, but you can actually make your own mold surface coat just from the epoxy that you're going to use. I add a little bit of thickener. This is colloidal silica, and I also add some graphite powder. Mostly the graphite powder is just to add some color to it, make it black. I like to have a nice black mold surface. Makes it look better than the kind of yellowish resin color that you get. But it also works to toughen up the mold surface a little bit, so it's less likely to scratch, less likely to gouge, and it protects that mold surface for a longer life of the mold. So let's go ahead and get started. Got my scale. Most resins are going to have a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 mix ratio. This happens to be a 2-to-1. And so I'm going to mix up about 20 grams of resin. And then we're going to add to that 10 grams of hardener. All right, we want to stir this really, really well. I'm going to go ahead and add just enough graphite powder to get this to a nice black color. I want it good and dark. All right, we're ready to add some colloidal silica. Again, this is a thickener, and we want a fairly thick coat for our surface coat on our mold. Makes it easy to brush it on, and it doesn't all run off and flow towards the middle of the part. It's especially important on this one where we've got vertical surfaces, no matter which way we orient the mold. It's going to want to dribble and run down those, so this keeps it all in place where we brush it. And that's what we're looking for right there. It goops up and it stays on the stick. It doesn't dribble down. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. That's exactly the consistency you want for brushing it onto the mold. Go ahead and take your brush. For this small of a part, an acid brush will work just fine. We're going to scoop some up and we're just going to go ahead and start brushing that onto our part. Now this is a tricky part. This is the area where we had that step where there was the fastener hole, and there was a pretty big step in the part right there. Areas like that, when you put your fabric down on the mold, it's going to have a hard time conforming around that tight curve, that tight radius. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a little extra into that area just to make a nice big fillet, so it's easier for the fabric to wrap around and you don't end up with a big void in your mold right there. All right, I've brushed the entire surface of the mold with my tooling coat. In addition to that, I've put a little bit of extra all the way around the edges. I try to keep about an inch of flange area outside the actual part all the way around. Again, that's going to give me that area to grab onto when I'm actually working in the mold, trying to lay up my part. We're going to let this sit until it just starts to get tacky. We don't want it to be super sticky when we put the fabric down, but you also want to be really, really careful. You don't want it to be too dry, because if it's too dry, if the tooling coat's already cured too much, then when we go to put our fiberglass down to make the back of the mold, it's not going to bond well to our surface coat, and the surface coat's just going to flake off later on. So you got to be really, really careful about that. Make sure you let it dry just enough that it's tacky. You want to be able to stick your finger on there and leave a fingerprint, but not so sticky that it's still swimming around when you go to put your fabric down. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get there. All right, we're back here. The mold is kind of tacky now. If I were to touch this, I'd be able to leave just a fingerprint, but it doesn't mush around, okay? That's what we want. That is perfect. Just a little bit of tackiness. I've got my fabric ready for me here, all set to go. These are fiberglass. This is 9 ounce per square yard fiberglass. And what I'm doing is I'm going to alternate plies. I'm going to have 45-degree plies, 0-90 plies, 45, 0-90, 45. I'm doing 6 plies. 3 090s, 3 45s, and again, they're alternating each one. All right, here's what I mean by the weave. You notice if you look at this layer on the right, the fibers are all going this direction and this direction. We call that a plus or minus 45 degrees because they're going 45 degrees to the length of that ply. Look at this one on the left, you notice that they're doing the exact opposite. They're going lengthwise and they're going crosswise. We call that a 0-90 because they're going 0 degrees and 90 degrees to the length of the part. Now, when I'm making my molds, I like to have about half of my plies go 0-90 and about half of my plies go 45. This balances it out so you don't get twisting in the mold as it cures. All right, we're all mixed up, ready to go. I'm going to take my first ply and go ahead and lay it down. Now, because we let the surface coat, the tooling coat, get nice and tacky, this should stick down nicely to the mold. And we shouldn't have to worry too much about it moving around when we start to wet it out. So go ahead and start draping it over the mold. I can feel it starting to stick just a little bit already, not too much. Now the way that ply sat down, it didn't quite want to make it quite all the way the wrap around the curve there. So I cut off the end that hung off, and I'm just going to go ahead and splice that in up here. It doesn't need to be perfect. Just going to splice it in just so it's continuous for this whole ply. And then again, trim off the excess. All right, take our brush. I use a much bigger brush this time. I want to make sure we get lots of epoxy into this fabric this time. This is not a place to be shy with your epoxy. Just slather it all on. Because the last thing you want to have in your mold is dry spots. You see little bubbles? Stipple them in with the tip of the bristles until those bubbles disappear. And if there are stubborn areas where you're still getting bubbles and the stippling isn't working, sometimes you can take your finger and just run it along there. You can squeegee all those bubbles right out of the fabric. All right, I'm ready for a second piece of fabric. All right, I'm going to give that a good 2 days to cure. That's twice as much as they recommend for this particular resin. For molds, I like to make sure it's fully cured before I try and pop the thing off, especially before I put my first part on. All right, it's been 2 days since I made this layup. It should have had plenty of time to cure now. We should be ready to pop the mold off of the original part. Let's see how it goes. Now, there's one thing I'd like to point out to you before we get going. I'm almost embarrassed to mention this, but I feel like it's worth saying. I underestimated grossly how difficult this part was going to be. And having had 10 years of experience in the composites industry, I should have known better. But a couple of issues that we've got here going on. First of all, it's got this compound curvature so that no matter which way I orient this part, it's going to have a vertical surface. And that twist in it makes it harder to lay the plies up. And so these plies right here, where it goes around this corner, there's a lot of tension in those. I couldn't get them to lay down really, really nicely. And even after I got them all set down and like brushed down, they started to lift up and create some voids. Hopefully the mold turns out okay. We'll see. The other thing is that anywhere where I had that ridge, that step in the part, it made a little bit of bubble in a lot of different places. So you can see all along here where there's a little bubble underneath the fiberglass. I'm a little worried about that. We'll see how it turned out. Maybe it's going to be okay, maybe it's not, but I guess we'll see. All right, so we're ready to pop it off of our part, see how this mold turned out. I'm going to start with the easy stuff. I'm going to try and peel off some of this flange that we built up all the way around the part. Now, if I were to do this again, the way I would prevent some of that problems that we just talked about is, first of all, I would cut reliefs in the fabric as I laid it down around this corner. Little slits going this direction on the part, not too deep, just enough that I could get those flanges, those little ribbons to all lay down nicely as it goes around that curve. That would keep some of that tension from lifting it up and causing this big voidy bubble that we've got right here. The other thing I would do is, as I talked before about making a nice fillet all the way around just because of that step. So I knew that step was there, but the fabric didn't conform to it nearly as well as I thought it would. And so if I were to do this again, I would make a much, much bigger fillet. I would actually fill that in so it was a very, very gradual transition from on top of the part to down on the flange. That way you don't have that big step that the fibers all have to go around. Because whenever you've got a big step like that, these fibers, the sharp corner, they don't go around that very well. That's where you're going to get bubbles. So those are the two things I would do to make this thing better next time. All right, we've got the flange all peeled off, all that foam board that we put on there. And now we're ready to go ahead and try and pop out the part. And this is where it's going to be a little more difficult. I'm going to try flexing the mold just a little bit to try and crack free some of these edges. Don't go too far, or what you might accidentally do is break the mold. You can get these little sticks. They're super handy. You can get them at a composite store locally if you've got one. If you don't, then what you can do is you can take popsicle sticks and just sand them down to a nice little sharp edge. And that sharp edge, you can wedge it in there, and it makes a beautiful tool for popping parts out of molds. The important thing is you don't want to use something like a screwdriver. A screwdriver or anything metal, you could really easily scratch your mold. You want to be careful not to do that. There we go. Well, there's our first look at the surface of our mold. Now it's important to note that we still got that this is the PVA that's flaking off. It's not actually the surface of our mold. So we'll wash that up with some warm water just to wash off all that extra PVA, and we should be ready to start putting our first parts in pretty soon. Now, there are a couple issues with this mold that are going to make this really, really tricky to do, especially if we don't use any vacuum pump like we're not going to do with this video. If you look here closely, there are these concave surfaces, these tight corners inside this mold that are going to make it really, really tough because the fabric does not naturally want to go around that corner. In fact, it's just not going to go around that corner all the way. We're never going to get it all the way tight down into those crevices without getting a bunch of bubbles all around the outside. The other thing is that Right here on this side, you notice that we actually have damaged our mold. As we pulled it off of the plug, the original part, we cracked along this edge of the mold and we lost a bunch of that surface coat. Well, what we're going to do about this is, I would love to keep this flange. Normally I would love to keep this flange on there. However, in this case, there's just no way I can do it. If you look at the surface of the mold itself, where the part is still okay. It's still intact. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim it right along that edge so we can maintain the entire surface of the part all the way around, but we're not going to have this big jagged chunk hanging off that's just waiting to catch some epoxy and break our part as the part comes out. So that's what we're going to do about that. Now what we're going to do about this corner right here, this internal corner, we can't get rid of this. I can't just cut it off because that's part of the part. And I really do need that there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up some epoxy with some Cavasil and some of that black carbon dust like we did for the tooling coat. And we're going to swipe that into that corner before we ever put fabric in the mold. Now you can get away with this to an extent. You don't want to do this somewhere in the middle of the part because it will show up. You'll be able to see it. But as long as we keep it local along that edge and we're really careful about it, I think we can get a good part out of this tool without having to use vacuum pumps or anything crazy. Let's give it a shot. Now when you're cutting carbon fiber or any composite, you really want to make sure you've got the proper safety equipment. Safety glasses, of course, and the dust on this is nasty, so make sure you're wearing a dust mask. And then for cutting it, I like to use a Dremel tool with a cutoff wheel, and we're just going to use that to go all the way around the edge. And then we're going to take some sandpaper and I'm just going to finish up that by hand and get it really close, right to the edge of the part where we want it to be. Our mold is prepped with 2 coats of wax and 1 coat of PVA, just like we did before. And we're ready to go ahead and start. Now, there are a lot of different ways you can get good surface finish in a part. But I'm going to show you one technique that doesn't require special tooling, no vacuum pumps, doesn't require any additional materials, no gel coats, nothing like that. This is a very simple way you can do it with just the materials we've used in the video already today. So all it involves doing is doing similar to what we did with the original part when we were making the mold. We're going to brush some epoxy in first, except this time it's going to be straight epoxy. We're going to brush this in and we're going to let it get tacky before we continue our layup. And what that's going to do is it's going to provide for us a nice, basically like a gel coat on the surface that keeps you from getting bubbles and other imperfections in the surface of your part, which you might otherwise get. Alright, now if this were any other mold with flat surfaces and no complex, really sharp corners, that would be it. That's all we would do until it was tacky and ready to put the fabric in. However, this mold has this really tight corner all along here. That's going to give us some grief when we go to put the fabric in the mold because the fabric's not going to want to conform to that really tight radius right there, that inside radius. So we're going to do something that's going to hopefully give us a nice surface finish, avoid getting bubbles in there, and it's going to look good. We're going to make a tooling coat similar to what we did before when we were making the mold. We're going to add some Cavasil. Now I'm going to try and make this not quite as sticky as it was before. A little teeny bit more runny, not too much. And then we're going to add some graphite powder. Now I'm going to put this into a bag. This is just a plain plastic bag like you'd find at the grocery store. Snip off the end. Alright, and we're going to run a bead of that all along the inside of this crevice. And I made this thin enough that as I squirt it in, it's flowing down into that crack and it's smoothing itself out by itself, so I don't have to go in and swipe it to get a nice smooth clean radius. It's doing that all by itself. Now we're going to let this go ahead and sit and let it get tacky, and as soon as it's tacky, we're ready to go ahead and put the fabric in the mold. All right, our surface coat is nice and tacky. We're ready to go ahead and put fabric in the mold and get this layup done. Once you've got the first ply tack down, just work it in place around this tight corner, gradually with your fingers. And where it's really tight right here, I'm going to just gently press it in with the tip of my brush handle. Once it's fully tacked down and pressed in place, you can start brushing in epoxy. We're going to do 4 plies on this one, a 45, a 90, a 45, and another 90. The last thing we want to do is, now that I've got all my plies down, I want to make sure everything's really tight down in that corner. So I'm going to run my finger in and just squeegee that fabric down in one last time before we call it quits for the day. It's good to hold your finger down at one place and then drag it. That way you don't pull the entire piece of fabric as you squeegee. Okay, now we'll let this go ahead and cure. All right, our laminate is all cured and we're ready to go ahead and demold it. This one should be pretty easy. Be able to grab the mold and pop it off. And there it goes. All right, got our first look. I'll go ahead and trim this. The best thing I've found to trim is a Dremel tool with a cutoff wheel. So I'll go ahead and do that. And we'll go ahead and finish it with a sanding block, just cleaning up those edges. I went ahead and washed off the PVA with warm water and it's ready to go. Hey, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. It's not perfect. There were a couple of little blemishes around the edges where I made a mistake of letting it sit and not checking it after about an hour or so of cure. And what happened is the edges started to lift up just a little bit in a couple of spots, and just a little bit of touch up with some sandpaper, and they look okay now. Just a little more attention to detail would have fixed those for sure. In this video, we went from an existing part to making a mold to making a final carbon fiber replica of that part. If you want a complete breakdown, a list of all the materials used for this project, go ahead and click on the link in the description. And hey, if this was helpful to you, click on that subscribe button because I'm going to be making more videos like this one in the future. Thanks for watching.